The test was still sitting on the edge of the bathroom sink when Simone heard the car pull into the driveway. She hadn't moved in 6 minutes. She knew this because the small gold clock on the vanity had been the only thing her eyes could find after she looked down at the two pink lines and felt the floor of the world drop out from under her feet. Not in a bad way, not exactly, but in the way it drops when something enormous and irreversible has just happened, and your body needs a moment to catch up with the reality your eyes have already processed. Two lines, a baby. Their baby. She pressed both palms flat against the cold marble of the sink and breathed. Outside, she heard the car door close, heard the low, familiar sound of Deshawn's voice as he said something to whoever had dropped him off, probably Marcus, his college roommate who had driven up from Atlanta for the wedding that was happening in 18 hours. 18 hours. Simone picked up the test, turned it over so she didn't have to keep seeing it, and then turned it back because not seeing it somehow felt like a betrayal of the truth. She was pregnant. She had been so careful, so painstakingly deliberate about not telling anyone, not her mother, not her sister Kezia, not even her best friend Tanya, who was sleeping in the guest room down the hall right now, and who could read Simone's face the way other people read text messages because she had wanted this moment to be hers and Deshawn's alone. She had imagined it so many times it had almost become a memory before it happened. The honeymoon, Ocho Rios, the open balcony with the sea below them and the nighttime sounds of Jamaica drifting up from the water. She would wait until the second evening, after the travel-exhausted first night, after they had found their rhythm, and she would tell him over dinner with the candles lit and his hand in hers across a white tablecloth. She had even rehearsed how he would respond. He would go still first, the way Deshawn always went still before something moved him deeply. And then his face would open up into that laugh she loved. The real one, not the company laugh he used in professional settings, but the one that came from his chest and meant he was completely unguarded. We're going to be parents. He would say it like it was the most extraordinary sentence in the English language. She put the test in the inside pocket of her overnight bag, zipped it closed, and stood up straight. Tomorrow she was marrying Deshawn Okafor, the man she had loved for 4 years, the man who had proposed to her on a rainy Tuesday in November at absolutely no special occasion whatsoever, just called her into the kitchen where he was cooking jollof rice, turned around from the stove with the ring in his hand and said, "I don't want to wait for a moment that feels big enough. You're already the biggest thing in my life." She had cried so hard she burned her hand on the pot trying to reach for him. She dried her face, she smoothed her robe, she went out to find him. The house Simone's mother had rented for the wedding weekend sat on 2 acres of manicured Georgia countryside, a sprawling white farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a view of rolling hills that turned gold in the evening light. It was the kind of place Simone had pinned to a secret board on her phone at 23, without ever expecting to actually stand inside it. The wedding would be in the gardens tomorrow afternoon. The florist had already delivered the arrangements, cascading white orchids and deep burgundy dahlias, their scent drifting through the open windows of the ground floor whenever the breeze shifted. Deshawn was in the kitchen when she found him, exactly where he'd been the night he proposed. He had his back to her, digging through the refrigerator for something, still in his clothes from the rehearsal dinner. Her heart did the thing it always did when she saw him without him knowing she was looking. A quiet, private kind of swelling, like a feeling that was too full for its container. He was a beautiful man, she didn't say that lightly. 6'2", broad-shouldered in the way that came from actual physical labor rather than a gym membership, with a face that had been constructed with the kind of precision that made strangers look twice and then try to pretend they hadn't. His mother was Igbo, his father from Memphis, and the combination had produced something that photography never quite did justice to. But it wasn't his face that had made Simone fall in love with him. It was the way he listened, the way he went completely quiet when someone was telling him something that mattered, like the rest of the world could wait. "Hey," she said. He turned. When he saw her, his expression shifted into something warm and easy. There she is. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and pulled her in without preamble, tucking her under his chin the way she fit there precisely. She pressed her face into his chest and breathed him in, warm cotton and that cedarwood soap he'd used since college, and felt, in that moment, so completely certain of everything that the secret in her overnight bag felt like pure, compressed joy. "You good?" he murmured into her hair. "Better than good." He held her tighter for a moment. "Tomorrow," he said, just the one word. "Tomorrow," she agreed. Tanya appeared in the kitchen doorway, wrapped in a silk robe the color of champagne, holding a glass of water. and wearing the expression she always wore when she was pretending she hadn't been watching something. "I was going to say something about not seeing the bride before the wedding," she announced, "but I'm too tired and that's not actually a thing for the night before." Deshawn released Simone and pointed at Tanya. "You look like trouble. Always have been." Tanya set her glass on the counter. "Deshawn, go be with your groomsmen. My girl needs sleep." "My groomsmen are asleep." "Then go watch film or whatever it is you people do." "You people?" He raised an eyebrow. "Grown black men the night before a wedding." Tanya waved her hand serenely. "Go." Simone watched Deshawn lean down and kiss her forehead once, slowly, before he went. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left, listening to his footsteps on the stairs, and felt so entirely at peace that she would replay this moment later as the last clean one, the last moment before everything shifted on its axis, and revealed that the ground she had been standing on was not the ground she thought it was. She couldn't sleep. It was past 2 in the morning and the house was quiet, the kind of deep country quiet she wasn't used to, without the ambient hum of Atlanta traffic that formed the white noise of her normal nights. She lay on her back in the bridal suite and tried every technique she knew. Breathing exercises, counting backward from 300, mentally walking through each room of the apartment she and Deshawn would move into together next month. Nothing worked. Her mind was too awake, too full, cycling between the pregnancy and the wedding and the speech she still hadn't finalized, and whether the caterer had confirmed the dairy. Free option for Aunt Celestine. Finally, she got up, pulled on her robe, and decided to go downstairs for tea. The house was dark except for the landscape lighting outside the windows, casting long pale rectangles across the hardwood floors. She moved quietly down the hallway, not wanting to wake anyone, and was halfway down the staircase when she heard the voices. Low, male. Coming from Deshawn's study, the small room off the main hallway that he'd claimed for the weekend to keep his suits and his groomsmen coordination materials, the door was not quite latched. A thin line of amber light ran along the doorframe. She assumed it was Marcus. Assumed she'd hear something about the bachelor dinner from 2 nights ago, some story she'd already heard a version of. She was almost at the foot of the stairs, almost past it, when she heard her own name. She stopped. "Simone doesn't know about any of this?" The second voice. Her mind placed it after half a second. Dre. Deshawn's cousin Dre, who had flown in from Houston and whom Simone had always found slightly too smooth, slightly too careful with his words. "No." Deshawn's voice. Flat. "Certain. And you're sure she's not going to find out?" A pause. A sound that might have been ice in a glass. "She won't." Simone's hand found the banister. She gripped it. "Because if she finds out," Dre said, "this whole thing falls apart. The deal, it's handled." Deshawn's voice had a quality she didn't recognize. Clipped. Businesslike in a way that felt wrong at this hour. Wrong in this context. "Camille knows what this is. It's been handled for 3 months." Camille. The name entered Simone's body like something cold and physical. She knew exactly one Camille in Deshawn's world. Camille Ashford, his former business partner's younger sister. Tall, light-skinned, the kind of woman who walked into rooms and immediately changed the atmospheric pressure. Simone had met her twice, once at a company event, once at a charity gala, and had registered both times the specific way Deshawn's attention realigned when Camille entered the space. She had told herself it was nothing. She had told herself she trusted him. 3 months. Dre exhaled. "So this has been going on since October." A beat. "Look, I love Simone. That's not what this is. But Camille and I have something." Another pause, and in the gap of it, Simone heard her own heartbeat in her ears, felt the cold of the banister under her palm. "It's complicated. It doesn't change anything about tomorrow." Simone didn't move. She wasn't sure how long she stood there. Long enough for the cold from the hardwood floors to work through the soles of her feet and up through her legs. Long enough for her eyes to adjust completely to the dark, for the pale rectangles of window light to sharpen into clarity around her. She heard Dre say something else, something about being careful, about people talking, and she heard Deshawn respond in that same clipped, certain voice, and then she heard the clink of glasses, the companionable sound of 2 men who were comfortable in their secret. She let go of the banister. She turned around. She went back up the stairs, one slow step at a time, her hand trailing the wall because her body needed something solid to orient itself. She went back to the bridal suite. She closed the door without making a sound. She sat on the edge of the bed, in the dark, in her silk robe, with 18 hours until her wedding, and she pressed her hand flat against her stomach and felt the specific quality of a world rearranging itself into a shape she didn't recognize. She didn't cry. She noted this as surprising. She had expected, if something like this ever happened, and she had never let herself imagine it would, that she would come completely apart, that the grief would be immediate and total. Instead, what she felt was something more like the sensation that follows a physical impact. That suspended moment between the collision and the pain, when the body is still processing what has happened. He loves me. He had just said it. That's not what this is. Which meant this was something else. Something that had been happening since October, when she and Deshawn had been in couples premarital counseling, when they had been signing the lease on their new apartment. When Deshawn had called her one Thursday evening just to tell her he'd heard a song that reminded him of her and wanted her to know. She pressed her hand harder against her stomach. A baby. Their baby. And the man who didn't know yet was downstairs with his cousin, relaxed, drink in hand, discussing the woman he had been seeing for 3 months, like it was a business arrangement that required management. Something moved in Simone's chest. Something that was not grief and not panic, but something harder and more deliberate. A decision taking shape, the way decisions form sometimes before the mind has consciously made them, assembling themselves out of character and history and the particular way a woman is built by everything she has survived. She was not going to fall apart. She was not going to run. She was not going to give Deshawn Okafor the satisfaction of watching her shatter. She sat in the dark and she thought, and when the thinking was done, she reached for her phone on the nightstand and found a number she hadn't called in over a year. She pressed call before she could reason herself out of it. It rang 3 times. Then a voice, low, careful, immediately alert in the way of someone who wakes fast. Simone? Caleb's voice. Deshawn's older brother, Caleb, who had always been the different one, quieter, more internal, who had looked at Simone the very first time Deshawn brought her home and treated her not like his brother's girlfriend, but like a person whose presence he was genuinely glad of. It's 2:30. What's wrong? She opened her mouth and discovered for the first time that night that her voice was not entirely under her control. Caleb? A pause. I need to talk to someone. A silence on the other end. Then the sound of movement, of covers being pushed back. Tell me where you are, he said. I'll come to you. Caleb arrived in 11 minutes. He knocked twice, soft, and she opened the door and let him in. He was wearing sweatpants and an old Howard University pullover, his locks loosely gathered, and he had that particular quality he always had in serious moments. A stillness that didn't feel passive but gravitational, like he was the fixed point around which other things could orient themselves. He looked at her face and she watched him register everything. The controlled expression, the 2 steady eyes, the way she was holding herself like someone who has decided that posture is the only thing left they can control. He sat in the chair by the window. She sat on the edge of the bed, and she told him. She told him about the voices, about the name, about the 3 months. She told it the way she had already decided she would tell it, without drama, without the heaving grief that was somewhere beneath all of this, waiting for a moment she wasn't ready to give it. She was precise and thorough. The way she was in her work as a structural engineer, the way she applied her professional mind to problems that required accuracy before emotion. When she finished, Caleb was looking at his hands. A long moment passed. I need to ask you something, he said finally. And I need you to know that whatever you say, I am on your side. Completely. Ask. What do you want to do? The question landed quietly between them, not, what are you going to do? Which would have implied a predetermined course. Not, you should, which would have presumed authority over her pain. Just, what do you want? She was grateful for the precision of it. I want to understand it first, she said. Before I do anything, I want to know what I'm actually dealing with. I won't make a decision based on one side of a conversation I heard through a door. Caleb nodded slowly. That's fair. But Caleb, she held his gaze. If it's what it sounded like, then we deal with it, he said, simply and without hesitation. She believed him. That was the thing about Caleb that had always distinguished him from his brother in ways she hadn't let herself fully articulate until now. Deshawn had charisma, that magnetic pull that made rooms respond to him, that quality that had made Simone feel in the early days chosen and lucky and luminous by proximity. But Caleb had something quieter and, she was beginning to understand, far more load-bearing. He had constancy. There's something else, she said. He waited. I found out this afternoon that I'm pregnant. The quality of the silence changed. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something move through his expression, a complicated sequence of things she didn't try to name, before it settled back into steadiness. Does he know? No. I was going to tell him on the honeymoon. Another pause. Okay, Caleb said. Not as an endorsement of anything, not as a response to what this information complicated, just as an acknowledgement that he had received it and would hold it. Okay. They talked until 4 in the morning. Caleb told her what he knew, which was more than she expected and less than she needed. He had heard, months ago, something that hadn't fully crystallized at the time. A conversation between Deshawn and Marcus that he had walked in on and out of, quickly because he didn't want to traffic in his brother's business. A name mentioned. An implication he had told himself might have been benign. I should have said something, he said. You didn't know what you knew. Still, Simone looked at him. Don't carry that. I need you focused, not guilty. He almost smiled at that. You're an engineer. I am an engineer. I build things that don't fall down, she said it quietly, and felt even as she said it, that she was talking about more than structures. By the time Caleb left, slipping back out into the dark hallway with a plan agreed between them, a plan that required her to do the hardest thing she had ever done. Simone had not decided on forgiveness or fury. She had decided on something that felt more powerful than either. Clarity. She was going to walk into this wedding with her eyes all the way open. She was going to know the full truth. And then she was going to act on it in a way that served not his comfort or her dignity in isolation, but the truth itself. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling until the first pale gray of morning appeared at the edges of the curtains. She did not sleep. She was magnificent at breakfast. This was perhaps the part she would later find most remarkable about herself, the sheer precision of the performance. She came downstairs at 8 in a pale yellow sundress with her hair pinned up, and she was warm and present and laughing at the right moments, and squeezing her mother's hand when the older woman teared up for the third time. Before 9 a.m. she ate eggs and drank ginger tea and let her bridesmaids fuss over her schedule, and agreed with everything the wedding coordinator said and smiled at Deshawn across the breakfast table with an expression that cost her more than any of them could have imagined. Deshawn watched her. She noticed this. He was doing the thing where he thought he was being subtle, the longer than necessary glances, the slight forward lean when she spoke, the way his eyes tracked her when she moved across the room. She wondered if this was guilt expressing itself or simply love wearing its usual clothes, and she found she couldn't distinguish between the two, which told her something important about the nature of what she was dealing with. After breakfast, while the bridesmaids were getting ready in the main suite and the house filled with the purposeful chaos of hair and makeup and steaming dresses, Simone slipped away. She had asked Tanya to cover for her. Just 20 minutes. I need air. And Tanya, who had been watching Simone with the sharpened attention of a woman who knows her best friend's face in all its weathers, had agreed without asking questions, but with an expression that said they would be having a very full conversation on the other side of this day. Simone met Caleb in the garden, behind the row of tall hedges that separated the ceremony space from the path to the parking area. He was already there, hands in his jacket pockets, his expression telling her before he spoke that the night had yielded something. I talked to Marcus, he said. And it's real. His voice was even, but underneath it she heard the effort that evenness required. Camille Ashford. They'd been seeing each other since October. Marcus says Deshawn called it off 2 weeks ago, told Camille it was over before the wedding. He thinks it was. Simone absorbed this, he thinks, but Caleb paused. Dre has been helping manage it, making sure she doesn't reach out, making sure there's no digital trail. That's what they were talking about last night. The morning air was warm and heavy with the scent of the orchids that had been arranged along the ceremony walkway. Somewhere behind the hedges, she could hear the string quartet warming up. The same quartet that had played at a fundraiser 6 months ago and that she had hired specifically because Deshawn had leaned over to her during the event and said, "These people are incredible. Can we get them for our wedding?" She stood with that information, turned it over, felt its weight. 2 weeks ago he ended it, she said. That's what Marcus says. So he made the choice. She said this carefully, feeling for what it meant. He chose to come into this marriage without telling me. Caleb said nothing because there was nothing to say. The thing that made this more complicated than simple betrayal, the thing that made it genuinely, agonizingly difficult, was that she understood, at some molecular level she wished she didn't have access to, the difference between a man who had made a catastrophic mistake and a man who was fundamentally dishonest. She had been with Deshawn for 4 years. She knew the interior architecture of him in the way you only know someone you have truly paid attention to. He was not a cruel man. He was not calculating. He was, she believed, a man who had let something happen that he shouldn't have let happen, and who had then handled it in exactly the wrong way, by trying to manage it into invisibility rather than bringing it into the light. This did not make it acceptable. It didn't even make it understandable. but it changed the nature of what she was dealing with. And Simone had always insisted on dealing with things as they actually were. She had a choice to make. The ceremony was in 4 hours. Caleb. She looked at him directly. I need you to get him. Bring him here, just him. Caleb studied her. What are you going to do? I'm going to give him one chance, she said. One. Before this goes any further. He tells me the truth himself right now on his own, or this wedding doesn't happen. A long pause. And if he does tell you, she looked at the orchids along the walkway. White and precise and exactly what she had chosen. Then I'll know who he actually is, she said, and I'll decide from there. Deshawn came around the corner of the hedges 11 minutes later, still in his dress shirt from breakfast, not yet in his tuxedo jacket. He saw her and his face did something complicated, an involuntary flicker of something she might have identified as relief if the morning weren't what it was. Caleb said you needed me. He came toward her. Everything okay? She held his gaze. Is there something you need to tell me? The stillness that followed was the longest of the 4 years she had known him. She watched him go through every stage of the decision, saw the moment when the instinct to deflect surfaced, saw it compete with something else, something deeper, and then saw the deeper thing win. He closed his eyes just for a second. Then he opened them. Yes, he said. And then, because it turned out that this was who he was when the evasion ran out, he told her. Not everything at first, not the full shape of it, but he started telling her. And once he started, he didn't stop, and it was this, the not stopping, that she would carry into what came next. He told her about Camille. He told her it had started at a conference in October. He told her he had ended it, genuinely and completely, 14 days ago, because he had stood in the bathroom of their apartment and looked at himself and understood that the man he was becoming was not the man he intended to be. He told her he was sorry in the way that people are sorry when they have no remaining defenses, plainly, without architecture. She listened to all of it. Then she said, I'm pregnant. The silence that followed this was different from all the other silences of the morning. His face, she watched it happen, completely opened. Something behind his eyes broke and rearranged. He stepped toward her, and she stepped back, and he stopped. Don't. Not harsh. Just clear. I need you to understand what you were willing to risk. Not just me, this. She pressed her hand against her stomach. You were going to walk into a marriage and start a family on top of a lie. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She stood in the Georgia morning air and breathed in the scent of orchids and let herself feel, for the first time since the staircase, the full weight of what this day had become. It was not what she had planned. It was not the story she had been telling herself for 4 years. But it was the true story, and she had always believed, even when it cost her, that the true story was the only one worth standing in. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, Go get dressed. We're not done talking. But we're going to finish this conversation with everyone watching, and you're going to know, before this day is over, exactly what I choose and why. Deshawn looked at her. He nodded once, and she saw in his expression something she hadn't seen there in years, or perhaps had never seen there. Before, not quite. A humility that was not diminishment but reckoning. He went back to the house. Simone stood alone in the garden, beside the orchids she had chosen, in the dress she had dreamed about, with the secret in her body and the truth in her hands. And she decided slowly, completely, and with the full force of who she was, what she was going to do with all of it. The church was the most beautiful thing Simone had ever stood inside. She had not grown up particularly religious, but her grandmother had been, fiercely and practically, and the Ebenezer Baptist where the ceremony was held carried that same quality of lived-in sacred space. The pews worn, smoothed by decades of black bodies at rest and in anguish and in joy, the stained glass filtering afternoon light into something amber and ancient, the smell of wood polish and old hymnals and fresh flowers that had no precise equivalent in any other setting. 400 people had come. Deshawn's family, his parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, radiating in concentric circles of the particular warmth and volume of big Nigerian-American families. Simone's family, her mother in a burgundy dress that had taken 6 weeks to find, her grandmother in the front row with a hat that required its own geography, her sister Kezia weeping behind her sunglasses already, and the ceremony hadn't started. Colleagues, friends, people who had watched this love story proceed over 4 years and who were here to witness its formal declaration. Simone stood in the vestibule in her dress. It was everything she had wanted it to be. Ivory silk with an off-shoulder neckline. Cathedral-length train, the kind of dress that felt like a statement rather than a costume. Tanya stood beside her, holding the bouquet, and was doing an extraordinary job of keeping her expression neutral, while her eyes conducted an intense private interrogation. I need you to trust me, Simone had said to Tanya that morning, sitting in the makeup chair with brushes moving across her face. I know you know something is different. I need you to let me handle it my way. Tanya had been quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Are you safe? Yes. Is this your choice? Completely. Tanya had picked up her own bouquet and straightened her spine. Then I'm with you. Now in the vestibule, the organ had begun. The processional music, a slow, gorgeous arrangement of a Stevie Wonder song that had been her grandmother's request and which Simone had said yes to without hesitation, floated through the heavy doors. She thought about Deshaun at the altar. She had made him wait in uncertainty all morning, had let him carry the weight of not knowing what she would do, because she believed that a man needed to understand what he had almost lost before she told him what came next. She had talked to Caleb 3 more times. She had talked to her mother once, briefly and carefully, because her mother was not a woman who could know something like this without it showing on her face. She had made a decision, not out of desperation or romantic foolishness, but out of the same structural thinking she applied to everything. What is this actually built from, and is the foundation strong enough to build on? The doors opened, the church turned, she walked. Deshaun was at the altar, and the moment he saw her, she watched 4 years of love and 3 weeks of shame, and this morning's reckoning all move through his face in the space of a second. He was a man standing at the exact intersection of who he had been and who he needed to become, and he looked like he knew it. She walked toward him steadily. She did not look at the guests or the flowers or the stained glass above. She looked at him. She let him be fully looked at. When she reached him, he took her hands. His hands were warm. They were the same hands. The officiant, their pastor, Dr. Vivian Cole, a small woman in her 60s with a voice that had always seemed too large for her body, smiled at them both and began. The words of the ceremony moved through the air around them with the weight of things that had been said for centuries, gathered together before God and these witnesses to join. Simone listened to every word. When Dr. Cole reached the vows and turned to her first, she looked at Deshaun one more time, one long, clear look, and then she turned slightly to face the congregation. Before I say my vows, she said, I'd like to say something. The church went very still. She heard Tanya behind her shift almost imperceptibly. She saw Deshaun's hands tighten slightly around hers, but she did not look at him yet. I found out 3 days ago that I'm carrying a child. The ripple through the church was immediate, gasps, soft exclamations, someone in the back making a sound of pure joy. Her grandmother's hat tilted forward as the old woman straightened. This baby is the reason I am standing here in a way that is different from what any of you expected. She paused. Let that breathe. I also found out last night that the man I am about to marry made a serious mistake. One that he's already told me about. One that he is already accountable for. The silence now was different, denser. She turned to Deshaun. I'm not going to tell our guests what happened, she said, speaking directly to him now. The congregation essentially witnesses to a private conversation. That's between us. But I need you to understand something in front of everyone we love so there's no confusion about what we're building. I am not a woman you manage. I am not a situation you contain. I am the person you are choosing, and choosing me means choosing honesty, even when honesty costs you everything you're afraid of losing. Her voice was clear, not trembling, not performing. Just clear. If you can do that, if you can become the man who tells me the truth when it's hardest, then I want to build this family with you. I want to raise this child with you. Not because I'm afraid to leave, but because I genuinely believe you can be who you need to be. I have seen that man. I know he exists. She paused, but I need you to choose him. Right now. In front of all of these people. The church was so quiet she could hear her grandmother breathing in the front row. Deshaun looked at her for a long time. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with performance. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but in the acoustic cathedral it carried clearly. I made the worst mistake of my life, he said. Not because I got caught. Because I almost let the best thing that has ever happened to me walk into a lie and call it a life. He stopped, gathered. I don't deserve the chance you're giving me. I know that, but I want it. And I will spend every day of this marriage proving that I understand the difference between what I had and what I was about to throw away. Dr. Cole, who had heard perhaps everything in 40 years of ministry, and whose expression suggested this was still in the upper tier, cleared her throat gently and looked at Simone. Simone looked at the man in front of her, the man who was flawed and afraid and had made a catastrophic choice and was now, with 400 people as his witnesses, trying to be honest about all of it. She thought about her grandmother's front row. She thought about the baby. She thought about what it meant to build something, truly build it. The way she built things professionally, on a foundation that had been inspected and found wanting and reinforced rather than hidden. She thought about what she had said to Caleb in the garden. I build things that don't fall down. Do you, Simone Antoinette Clark, Dr. Cole said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had just watched something real happen in a space, usually reserved for ceremony, take Deshaun Marcus Okafor to be your husband, to love, to honor, and to speak the truth with, in all of the days that are given to you, a beat. 2. The kind of silence that becomes its own answer before the words arrive. I do, Simone said. The reception was held on the grounds as the sun dropped behind the Georgia hills, and the fairy lights came on in the trees, turning the space into something golden and almost unreal. Simone danced with her grandmother first as planned, to a slow Roberta Flack song that the old woman had requested. Her grandmother held her face in both hands at the end of it and looked at her the way she always looked at her, as though she could see all the way through to the interior. You know what you did in there, her grandmother said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. Good, she patted Simone's cheek once. That's what love actually is, not the feeling. The decision to build the real thing instead of the pretty one. Simone held on to that. Later, when the dancing was fully underway and the night had its own momentum, Caleb found her at the edge of the dance floor. He stood beside her, and they looked out together at the room, at Deshaun moving through it with a quality that was different from the morning, as though something had been put down and something else picked up, a specific lightness that Simone recognized as relief at no longer having to maintain the architecture of a secret. How are you? Caleb asked. I'm deciding, she said honestly. He nodded. This was something she had always appreciated about him. He understood that deciding was a full and respectable answer, that it didn't require resolution in order to be legitimate. He's going to have to do a lot of work, she said. He will. Caleb's voice was certain in the way that came from knowing someone thoroughly. He's not. He paused, choosing his words with the care she recognized as characteristic. He's not a bad man. He made a bad choice and then compounded it with a worse one. There's a difference. I know. She had always known. The knowing hadn't made the morning easier, but it was making this evening possible. That's why we're still here. She looked out at her husband moving through the reception, and she felt something that was not uncomplicated but was genuine. A love that had been tested and had not entirely passed the test, which was different, she understood now, from a love that had failed. Things that were genuinely tested and survived were built differently from things that had never been tested at all. She was an engineer. She knew this in her bones. She pressed her hand once briefly against her stomach. A baby was coming. A whole person who would arrive into this family and needed to be something real, something load-bearing. She and Deshaun had a long, honest, probably painful road ahead of them, the kind that required couples therapy and difficult conversations and the willingness to look directly at things that were easier to avoid. She was not naive about this. She had never been naive. But she was also, she realized, standing in a room full of everyone she loved, under lights, someone had strung through trees specifically to make this night beautiful, wearing a dress she had dreamed about, having made the bravest decision of her life in front of 400 witnesses, not brave in the direction. People expected bravery to go, not in the walking away direction, but brave in the direction of, I see the full truth and I am choosing to build anyway. Deshaun found her just before midnight. He came and stood beside her without touching her first, giving her the choice of proximity, and she took it, stepped slightly into him, let his arm come around her, felt the familiar weight of it. I know the road ahead isn't going to be easy, he said. No, she agreed. I know I have to earn this. You do. A pause. The music from the dance floor drifted over to them, something slow and easy and southern. Simone. His voice when he said her name had something in it she had not heard before. Not the confident, easy warmth of the Deshaun she had fallen in love with, but something quieter and more fundamental. Like he was saying her name for the first time and understanding what it meant to be allowed to say it. Thank you for not letting me disappear into who I was becoming. She looked up at him, this man, this complicated, beautiful, fallible man who had almost, through a failure of courage, destroyed the best thing in his life, and who was now, she believed, genuinely committed to understanding what had been almost lost. Don't be different, she said, every day. That's the thank you. He nodded, held her tighter. She let him. Above them, the fairy lights held steady in the Georgia dark, strung between trees that didn't care about human drama, just growing the way they grew, rooted in something deeper than the weather on any given day. Around them, the people they loved moved through the evening, laughing and dancing and doing the ordinary, miraculous work of celebrating two people who had chosen each other, chosen the real version of each other. the version that included the parts that were hard to look at. There is a kind of love that chooses what's beautiful and calls it devotion. And there is another kind, harder to find, harder to sustain, that looks at the full thing, all of it, including the damage and the failure and the mourning when everything came apart, and makes the decision to build anyway, deliberately, with eyes open and hands steady. Simone Clark Okafor was an engineer. She had always known which kind of structure held. Some betrayals arrive as endings. And some, the ones you survive with your eyes open, turn out to be the blueprints for something that actually lasts.